Welcome to the What If podcast. We are discussing philanthropy, and this is the philanthropy series. This is the second part of our discussion. In the first discussion, we took time to just unpack what philanthropy is, and more so what African philanthropy is. Tendai, welcome back.
Thank you.
How are you feeling this time?
Much better.
Yes, I love it. I love it. You're more relaxed, and it's okay. It works for us.
Sure.
So, in the previous episode, we defined what African philanthropy is, and I used the word altruism. What was your definition, by the way?
Yeah, I think I made reference to communities coming together voluntarily and resolving problems. But I also used the Greek definition to say philanthropy universally is understood as the love for humanity.
When we look at the study of philanthropy, it somewhat seems that African philanthropy is the new kid on the block, right? Can we just take time to look at how it has evolved? And in Africa, what was it like, possibly pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial? You don't have to use that time frame.
Sure.
That's just for me to kind of understand how it has evolved over time.
Okay. So for those who were with us in the first episode, I made reference to three tendencies in philanthropy, all of them having different historical sort of moments. I think the high net worth, yes, it may sound, even the way I framed it, it may sound like it's a 21st century phenomena. But if you go back into African history, by the 14th century, we had high net worth individuals. And up to now, many people are still computing Mansa Musa's wealth. He was a king based in Mali. It is said that in terms of wealth, if you were to factor in inflation and everything, you could still be richer than Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates combined.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So, and also when you went to Mecca, one of the trips that is recorded was he was Muslim. His trip to Mecca, he was passing different communities and gifting them with gold. So I would say that's one of the most sort of known or recorded moments of an African high net worth individual who is actually engaged in giving, gifting, or just philanthropy. Right. Yeah. So it's got that history. Then the other ones, the other tendency I made reference to around intermediaries, it's a fairly new phenomena, but I wouldn't say that what we have beginning in the 21st century is really the precursor to it. Intermediaries were also very influential in aggregating gifts towards the struggle for independence.
Yes.
We had so many formal and informal channels where we're receiving aid from those who were in solidarity with African countries to achieve their own liberation. So I would say the idea of an intermediary institution, either based on the continent or outside of the continent, but engaged in mobilizing resources to support African causes, has got a longer history than what I made reference to. It's found actually in the colonial times when we are doing that. Then the other strand I spoke about, what I called horizontal platforms or mechanisms of solidarity and giving. Those ones, I don't think they have a start date. You know what I mean? When we engage with philosophers, both Western and African, there are those who want to make us believe that our history comes from an understanding of being individual, that our existence was Hobbesian in nature, that we could not tolerate each other, that whenever we met a stranger, we fought. But when we begin to look at history in terms of its evolution, then when we get to the place where we call the Stone Age, where human beings are beginning to use some form of tools to organize their production, their hunting, etc., we begin to see actually the coming together of hunting communities, the hunters and gatherers coming together to do things collectively. And it becomes more pronounced when you get to the stage whereby we are now moving towards settled communities, and we're now engaged in agriculture, in pastoralism, communities emerge, and we begin to see again those forms that I made reference to, forms of pulling together labor, pulling together assets, pulling together savings, and also being a support for each other during times of famine. So I would say that that form of philanthropy is as old as African societies.
So is it safe to say that African philanthropy is what actually underpins the social structures within African communities?
I would say yes. That's what I've been making reference to say African philanthropy, for me, its brazen attempt or aspiration is to be the catch-all discipline that includes sociology, that includes anthropology, and many other studies, even political science. So if you use that, then African philanthropy, because as we study African philanthropy, we actually deploy tools from those various fields. So if you're using African philanthropy in that sense, then you begin to say, if you really look at African societies, their mechanisms of social organization and agency actually provide a framework for us to understand philanthropy. But in this instance, it's the philanthropy that I made reference to, saying the code we give is Ubuntu, coming from Southern Africa, but also having a very Pan-African feel. This I am because you are, or you are because I am. So that's what we can actually begin to say, that philanthropy is trying, in a brazen manner, to really capture all these things, to say, when you look at all these things, there's no way you can say Africa is not philanthropic.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at what values and community structures influence philanthropy in Africa.
Yeah, so I think this is a very important question, and thanks for raising it, because the philanthropy that is in Africa, and maybe one of the reasons that sets it apart from what we see in the global north, especially in the West, is actually that African philanthropy is probably more values-based than just looking at resources, because the big value being the value of Ubuntu. So that mutual respect and understanding of mutual interdependence, that there's no way you can be rich here and next door everyone else is struggling. That does not define our humanity. So things like inequality, by their very nature, are strange to how African societies are organized, because within African social organization is a concept of egalitarianism. This thing of saying we'll share whatever we have. That's why our colleagues like Alan Fowler and Susan Maposa have come up with the term the poor philanthropists. Because what they are trying to do is trying to show and to demonstrate how horizontal forms of giving are actually at the center of keeping African societies moving forward.
Right, okay. So with that being said, you are saying we come from a place of we are coming together to make things work, and that's what informs our philanthropy.
Yes, but I want to hasten to add, because I don't want to sound like I'm romanticizing an edge or a certain specific aspect of Africa, because Africa is also, in the same vein that I say that we are mostly rural, but Africa is also urbanizing at a very rapid pace. And the urban space is a coming together of strangers to settle in one area. So there's always the assumption that traditions, norms of living that were common in rural spaces that were undergirded by what I always make reference to, say, customary tenure, etc., that they will easily be prevalent in the urban areas. It does not necessarily follow. Yes, we have seen certain communities trying to mimic or trying to replicate models that they sort of came up with from the rural areas. But also we see a lot of individualism. Absolutely. We see a lot of selfishness. We see a lot of inequality. We actually see better households coexisting within a space of very desperate circumstance, and we don't see flows of resources going into the neighbors. So I think the idea of I am my neighbor's keeper in the urban areas is a bit stretched and is a bit challenged. So we see this in, because some of our studies are in low-income areas, such as here in Zimbabwe, in Chitungwiza, in Kulumane, in Popoma. What we're beginning to see there is, at the beginning, when people come and they purchase houses there, they actually forge communities. They can actually go ahead and do this stuff that I'm talking about. But what we see after 10, 20 years, a generation passes on. There's a new layer or new set of owners or tenants in those areas. They are not necessarily as communitarian as what we would have seen from the founders. So something dies in the urban areas.
So I'm thinking about the correlation of modernization and the move away from somewhat communal areas, and how it seems to define how philanthropy manifests. So can we say that the more affluent people become, or the move from, to low income to high income or middle class people, there is less philanthropy, or the identity of philanthropy changes?
The ideal picture is that the more people become affluent, they are more concerned about others. That's when they give, because now they have something to give. As
Is
a
that a
separate,
true
as a
hypothesis?
no, I'm saying that's the assumption you
Okay.
would make. But people begin to give differently, or to behave differently. Because what is at stake, or the issue that we may not have addressed now, is what kind of forms of social organization does capitalism breed? In
Doc,
the
you're
urban-
going into our other episode where we
Okay,
want to
okay.
discuss philanthropy and capitalism.
Okay,
So,
okay.
but it's quite an interesting, and it's so tempting to discuss it now because I do want to bring in the idea of, so now there's middle class people. We assume that they have extra income. Does that really mean because they've got extra income, they are giving?
Yeah, but you
And
see,
the type of giving?
but you see, I think, given the fact that I've already made reference to the fact that our giving was never necessarily about the surplus, it was a value that I am my brother's keeper. And when you were in communities, if you have ever visited or lived in the rural areas, almost everyone around you, you know their business, yeah, and you are related somehow. Yeah?
Some form of kinship.
Exactly.
yes.
So there's some form of kinship, etc. So it's easier to spread the love. It's easier to spread whatever you have because the fields are seen. We can tell that nonsense field, that's Tendai's field. So we can see those are Tendai's cattle, etc.
Yeah.
And he's so and so's son. He comes from here, etc. So it's easier for us to begin to say, we'll shame you if you don't give because you're being selfish. But in the urban areas, like I said, it's strangers coming together.
I mind my business, you mind your business.
I don't know my neighbors.
Yeah, we live in the same neighborhood,
So I think the process of urbanization in itself kills something about us. And one of the things that suffer is the solidarity, which we're calling African philanthropy. So by just moving, but what I have seen, and many studies have shown this, that people from similar villages in the urban areas, they may not be neighbors in the urban areas, but they look for each other. And they begin to establish associational platforms such as burial societies or whatever. The idea being to mimic that or to help each other in the event of disasters happening back in the village. So we've seen this in African cities, but also interestingly in the diaspora. When people go into the diaspora, you assume that they just take on the identity of saying, I'm Zimbabwean, I'm Zambian, but they also take on the identity of the districts or the rural areas where they come from.
That
And
is
they
quite
begin
interesting.
and they begin to organize themselves around that to begin to say, we want to build a hospital in our village. So they call for people who come from that village. I belong to an old school association, so we are organized together with colleagues from all over, who are all over in the diaspora, around the idea of the school we went to. So that's sort of a community that we belong to for 4 or 6 years. So that's how people organize themselves. They just don't go there and say, you know what, I'm living in Australia now, I'll associate with any Zimbabwean. They may do that, but when it comes to the movement and the organizing of resources, there's something that creates an identity that we all run towards.
Beautiful. So I think that's a beautiful illustration of African philanthropy in modern times. So modern philanthropy. I'd like us to just take a look at the role of colonization on African philanthropy. What did it do? What did it change? I think one of the things you've already mentioned is modernization, people urbanizing, and how philanthropy looks like in those areas. But what did it affect then?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. Colonization, especially for us in Zimbabwe, others in Kenya, Namibia, and South Africa, we were disrupted by what you may call settler colonization. Settler colonization was brutal. It displaced communities, whole communities. So we moved from where we were into less fertile areas, less favorable areas, so that we could make way for the colonizers. That was a power game. But already there's that disruption. So what it did, the first thing it did was to actually curtail our wealth accumulation trajectories. So it's captured very well in one of Thabo Mbeki's sort of autobiographies when he talks about his grandfather, who was a large farmer in the Eastern Cape provinces, in the Eastern Cape. But when he now talked about the next generation, that was his father, they didn't have as much wealth because their land had been taken, etc., etc. So that's what settler colonization did. It disrupted wealth accumulation within African societies, thereby also disrupting possibilities of the growth of this high net worth based. Because even in the rural areas, I always say the rural areas, the assumption is they are made up of equal households. But there are classes. In isiZulu, there is the Inkinsela class. These are people who are rich, they have cattle, they are better off than the other farmers. In Shona, there's Hurudza, who's a better farmer, better off farmer. The Hurudza, and it's captured very well in the book by, I'm forgetting it now, when you talk about Bamkuru. Bamkuru being a better off, he's a headmaster in the communities, etc. But that's the idea of rural differentiation. So if you understand rural differentiation, you know that there's already a class that is capable of helping out others, especially when money is introduced in the rural economy through the need for payment of school fees for children. So the richer uncles will then pay for school fees for their nephews and nieces. So that becomes an issue when colonization happens, because it disrupts wealth accumulation and actually is initially attempts to kill the middle class layer so that they remain dependent on selling their labor, etc. So that's number one. I think that's a huge disruption. But the second disruption is actually the disruption of the sense of community. Because remember, they are displaced and some are moved to other areas. So they spend years again trying to forge new ties, to re-establish ties, but also to begin to re-establish certain traditions of caring, etc., etc. And given for countries that, like Zimbabwe, that then go on a protracted liberation struggle, the liberation struggle, as beneficial as it is, it also destroys the fabric of society, because there are then two kinds of people. You're either a sellout or you're a patriot. So already kills trust, because the philanthropy that is under discussion is based on trust. Social literally huge levels of trust. So in a moment whereby there are external factors that are pushing communities not to trust each other, you actually begin to kill solidarity. Because people now no longer trust each other, they no longer come out in the open to discuss what they have or the needs they have. So those are the disruptions that are related to colonization. The third one is what we have already mentioned, this urbanization, the migration. So you begin to see now women-headed households being the major sort of a phenomena in the rural areas, because the males are going into the wage labor economy, which is on the mines, which is in the urban areas. So women are now expected to establish these new forms of solidarity, to establish these networks. But it's a challenge. It is a challenge in itself, because the households now are one-legged. And we are beginning to see that production is on the lower side, but even the ways in which we're negotiating collective spaces is limited. Because remember, women are actually strangers in these communities. They've been brought in from other communities to be married to these people. Now they're the ones who have to establish new forms of community.
I had a thought
when
you brought about the issue around, rural homes being led by women. What does that do for philanthropy within those communities? Can I say then that philanthropy has a female face in those communities? So even when you talk about the burial societies, is it both men and women, or is it mostly women? When we talk about the bringing together of funds together, you mentioned that in our first episode. Is that men or women? This is like the gender aspect of philanthropy.
That's a very interesting question, actually. So I would say one thing that we've known through different agriculture economic studies is that smallholder agriculture, which is the common feature in Africa, is feminized. It's women-led. It's women-dominated. So if then we are asserting that smallholder agriculture or peasant agriculture actually thrives on the basis of these collective forms of associational life, savings groups, labor pooling, asset pooling, and also marketing groups. We assume that these are all women. There's a vast majority of members who are women, etc. So I would say that aspect, yes, I would say women are playing a huge role. Yeah. Women are playing a huge role. And that's a good study area, actually, that needs to be explored. But I want to come back to the burial societies thing. So the burial societies that my father used to attend way back in the 80s in Mlawi, they used to meet at a beer hall. Yeah, on a Sunday.
A meeting.
Yeah, a meeting.
Okay.
So burial societies, if you have to study this, burial societies across Zimbabwe actually meet in beer halls. So beer halls are male spaces,
yes,
majority of times. So in our family, the member of the burial society was not my mom; it was my dad, and it was a group of fathers who would meet in these male spaces not friendly to women, etc. And they would meet on strange days. I think they used to meet on a Sunday morning. We would go to church and my dad would go to a burial society meeting. So already even the organization of the days, etc., tells you something about how it's organized. Right. So I think there's that disjuncture. But burial societies, remember also, and it speaks to some of the things that we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. I've talked about men leaving the rural area and surrendering women, smallholder agriculture, even their plots to be managed by their wives. Mm-hmm. Then they're going to urban spaces. And what do? They establish burial societies for their village. So you can see the division of labor, that in the rural areas, women organize themselves around their production. Men are thinking about, if one of us was to die here, how do we transport him to the village, etc., etc.? What support do we offer each other? So I think there's that sort of division of labor. Depending on place and space, you actually find that some places can be male dominant. I'm not so sure what is happening now, because since my parents, both of them died, I've never
tapped into the space.
I never thought of joining a burial society. Yeah. But I'm told they still exist. But again, that's another thing that we need to explore, to say, how are they existing? What is the dynamic there? What is the level of participation, gender distribution, etc.?